Empyrean by Kevin Morse. Pluto was much more impressive than Dane had been led to believe. A lifetime of hearing it referred to as the dwarf planet seemed foolish now that he was seeing it with his own eyes. Though dimly illuminated and barely visible, it was massive. His father once expressed how strange it felt that the dwarf was once again classified as a planet. Though Pluto had been the farthest known planet from the sun during Dane's parents' childhood, the celestial body eventually had its title revoked in their teenage years, being reduced to nothing more than a large rock in the eyes of the scientific community. Now, in 2047, more than halfway through their lives, Pluto had been restored to its former glory. This was Dane's first stop on his solo tour of the Milky Way. Suspended in zero gravity, he stared out of the transparent, bubble-like spacecraft that was his transportation and life support. In reality, it was his coffin. In fact, that's what the vessel was actually called. He heard a beeping tone followed by the soothing voice of what sounded like a middle-aged British woman.
Prepare for warp to stop 2.
Bracing to travel from Pluto to Neptune in a matter of minutes was more of a mental task than a physical one. In zero gravity, moving at such tremendous speed reminded him of his youth when he would ride in his father's car, going a mere 70 miles per hour. There was a high-pitched revving that slowly grew louder, resembling a plane picking up speed on a runway. This was warping. All he could see were the dull, blurry streaks of light from passing stars. Just when Dane thought the sound couldn't get any louder, it was gone completely, leaving behind an eerie silence and a ringing in his ears. When he gathered himself, he braced against the interior of the coffin to pivot around and absorb his surroundings. The sphere was designed to make its inhabitants feel as if they were free-floating in space without a spacesuit. Glancing back, Dane saw only black. There was no sign of Pluto. It was hard to believe he had been there only moments ago. But this thought became irrelevant when he turned his gaze forward to the planet he was gradually approaching. He flinched, shutting his eyes tight at the sting of bright blue light. Perhaps it wasn't as intense as it seemed, as Dane had just been in darkness and dim light for so long that anything more radiant than Pluto seemed blinding. The rich blue backlit the red interior of his eyelids, resulting in a deep violet. When the shock had passed, he slowly opened his eyes. There before him, putting the dwarf planet's name into perspective, was Neptune. Though the coffin floated far enough away to avoid the planet's gravitational pull, it still took up nearly all of Dane's field of view. To say the planet was blue would be a severe injustice. It boasted every variety of the color, perfectly blended into one stunning display. Every shade seen in photo-enhanced images of the Caribbean blended with the color of a clear sky and the darkest indigo dye imaginable. It was a beautiful reminder of why Dane wanted to do this in the first place. This was Neptune in all its splendor, named after the god of the sea, dreamt up at a time when men were less scientific. This was the world where it rained diamonds. On rare occasions, courageous men would brave the gas planet in hopes of collecting one of these precious raindrops to give the woman they loved. Dane might have done the same had he ever found someone that drove him to such risks of affection. A pang of regret tore at his chest as he remembered Sylvia, the short brunette with a cute smirk and the stunning blue eyes he'd met in college. Neptune had evoked the memory of those eyes. Thinking of it now, he wished he had taken a chance for once in his life. So what if she had been out of his league? Miracles happened, right? But it didn't matter now. If anything had happened, she would have been one more person to leave behind. But there was still so much he hadn't done. He couldn't be here. Surely this wasn't what it had come to. It was a dream. He must be hooked up to a Dreamweaver, a device that would allow him to pre-program such an experience. No. He was very much awake and he knew it. The realization of just how quiet it was snapped Dane out of his mental struggle. He had never experienced silence of this caliber before. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, and the coffin had momentarily stalled for easy viewing. If it were not for the invisible engine's low purring, the lack of sound would have been maddening. He could never dream up such stillness. Of course not. In fact, he remembered every minuscule detail leading him here. This was real, and it was passing him by. His full attention returned to Neptune. It was arguably the most breathtaking thing he had ever seen. He couldn't believe this was the one and only time he would see it.
Prepare for warp to stop 3.
Dane tensed. Was it time already? It felt like he had just gotten here. His vision strained in an attempt to take a mental photograph of the magnificent blue sphere. He focused on the planet until it became a streak of colorful light and vanished, like a vapor. It was dark again, and Dane became acutely aware that he was alone. The flash that followed made Neptune seem dull. This time he covered his eyes with both hands until the noise of the coffin faded. He slowly separated his fingers, gradually allowing portions of light in until he could bear it. Now, with his sight fully adjusted, he beheld Uranus. The planet was no less majestic despite its lack of visual variety. Its color resembled the sky from the view of an airplane window. A genuine smile cracked across Dane's face for the first time since this series of events had begun. This glorious ball of gas had been the butt of immature jokes since it was named. Dane realized that he hadn't matured past the point of appreciating a good Uranus joke in his 24 years of existence. Even in this day and age, the astronomers tried to make everyone believe it was pronounced Uranus. Yeah, that's better. Now it sounds like urine. A muffled chuckle slightly shook his body. But why was he holding it in? If he wanted to have a good laugh, there was no one here to judge him. In fact, he should seize these opportunities while they existed. He decided to let loose. However, when he did, he found himself choked up. Scientists believe there is a thin line between emotions, and in that moment, Dane's emotional divider eroded. This was not the time for jokes. Tears welled up in his eyes, but the sorrow left him quickly, replaced by a heat that rose in his chest and erupted from him in a scream. This wasn't fair. What had he ever done to deserve such a fleeting view of the universe? It seemed, at least at the moment, that the real joke here was on him. He'd been given the opportunity to glimpse the heavens, just to have the longing it created left unsatisfied. He heard the voice warning him to prepare himself. This time, he found it less soothing. Uranus sped away, and Dane swore at the top of his lungs. Another planet had come and gone. When he imagined this day, it certainly never played out this way. His anger cooled and softened into guilt. He was not making the most out of this. The 10-minute stop at each planet went fast enough without his constant zoning out. He was living a lifelong dream, one that had cost his parents dearly, and he had the nerve to say his circumstances were unfair? Besides, the next stop was the planet he had desired to see most since he first looked up at the stars. Then, within the span of a few seconds, he finally did. Dane had seen his share of rainbows while growing up on Earth, every color side by side in a streak of promise. However, when the rings of Saturn came into focus, it was as if he had never seen color at all. Encircling the planet was the most harmonious mingling of hues Dane thought could exist. Surely this was the pinnacle of what his eyes could behold in this life. He told himself to breathe it in deeply. The rings blended the visible spectrum so perfectly that what had to be millions of tints appeared to be one dazzling color, one that could no more be described than dissected. His favoritism had been well placed. This alone was worth the voyage, and this alone could provide him with the inspiration he needed to finish the trip. This was his refreshment. He tried his best to make the allotted time last as long as possible. He couldn't have been more in the moment. He didn't think. He only beheld. But, just like the last 24 years of his life, the time passed before he knew it. Never had the automated announcement been more unwelcome. Tears and warping blurred everything as his vessel lunged forward once again. Jupiter was impressive. This was to be expected given that it was the largest planet the Milky Way had to offer, and it was no modest offering. Ahead of him, there were no traces of black space. The colossal planet was all he could see. Though its color varied in places, the majority of the gas giant looked like a haze of orange cream sherbet. These thoughts raced through his mind almost as quickly as the stars at warp. Though confronted with the most massive planet he would ever see, Dane's mind hadn't left Saturn. Its majesty seemed almost more desirable now that it was behind him. If he could just go back, what he wouldn't give to see it one more time. He prayed in his head. He was more than prepared to strike up a deal with the Almighty, maybe even the devil if that's what it took. But then what did he have to offer? Naked he had come, and he felt barely clothed now. Black. Dane had been so lost in thought that he missed the warp announcement. The darkness sent his system into mild shock as his mind caught up. He feared for a moment that he had gone blind. He remembered experiencing the feeling once before when waking in the middle of the night to find that the power was out. There was no difference between his eyes being open or closed. The next object that appeared was much easier on his eyes, allowing them to adjust with much less strain. The red sphere that was Mars seemed as tiny as Pluto after just leaving Jupiter. He had been to this planet before. Its atmosphere was splotchy today, exposing much of the ball's surface. Even from this distance, Dane could see the dome settlements spanning the barren terrain. When Earth had overpopulated before he was born, Mars, being dubbed more suitable than the Moon, became the first planet to be colonized. This hadn't been the exodus that solved the overpopulation issue, only the first major step towards it. Eventually, man would break the perimeter of the galaxy itself and find refuge elsewhere. It was this elsewhere that Dane had come to call home before leaving on this voyage. Was it really his home now? The sight made him reminisce again. He had many fond memories on Mars. Best 4th grade field trip ever. It was on this planet that he had discovered the thrill of low-gravity trampolines, an activity he enjoyed well into his early 20s. That was also the spring he met his best friend Jason and was pretend married to Molly Woodcomb. He wondered what each of them was doing at this exact moment. Jason had come by the house to see him off just yesterday, a friend loyal to the end. Last he'd heard about Molly, she was for real married and had a few kids. Probably living a normal life. Must be nice. Before he could think further, the warp announcement jerked him back to the present. The next stop was Earth. It was perfectly ironic that he would visit his birthplace today. His family had left the Goldilocks planet when he was 12 for another. He never realized just how he had taken it for granted. The world was beautiful. From this view, he could see the rich blues of the ocean separated by continental browns and greens. It was day on this side of the world. Dane could just barely glimpse the shadow over the area experiencing night. In place of the natural colors shone billions of artificial lights from millions of cities. This too had a beauty of its own. What a unique planet. It was almost as if it was tailor-made just for humanity. Everything was there. Though man's mass exodus through the stars eventually yielded fruit, the right conditions had to be sought out. Here on Earth, it had all been provided. The loneliness returned. How he longed to go down there. So what if the planet was at max capacity? He wanted nothing more in that moment than the company of another person. He thought of his parents. He thought of his siblings. He thought of his friends, or the ones who had proven themselves true by sticking around. Dane curled into a ball and wept bitterly, a fetus in the womb of the cosmos. He was born alone, and he was alone now. But man wasn't meant to be alone, was he? The sorrow threatened to take him, and when the ship warped and the blackness of space returned, he nearly succumbed to it. What was the point? Every beautiful thing came and went. Vanity. But suddenly, the goddess of love and beauty appeared from the void, and with her, perspective. Once hollow truths Dane had heard his entire life became relevant and deeply meaningful. At the beginning of time, there was nothing but darkness. But just as Venus had just come into view, so everything had materialized from nothingness, guided by the very force that had woven the intricacies of Saturn's rings. Beauty was a matter of contrast. Without the vast darkness of space, the light of each planet he encountered would not have blinded him. Something from nothing. And not just that, but something breathtaking. This was beauty in its purest form. Was this not his life? Naked he had come, from nothing, with nothing. Not only this, but he was given the rare privilege granted only to the human race to behold and to have the capacity to appreciate the things created alongside him. Venus vanished. It was no less beautiful for disappearing. Actually, it was more beautiful. Mercury approached steadily as the warp stalled. Dane wiped away tears that had accompanied the unexpected moment of appreciation. For the first time, he noticed a rise in temperature. It was strange that he could feel it at all. As soon as it had come to his attention, the coffin detected the increase and compensated for it. That was what it was designed to do, after all, keep him comfortable until he reached his final destination. This is what his parents had paid so much to provide for him. Funny how man had tamed the external hazards of deep space by inventing spacecrafts like this. Yet it was what dwelled within him that had ultimately spelled his end. In fact, the force eating him from the inside was what had led him to make this voyage in the first place. It had robbed Dane of every choice but one. How did he want to die? The lone astronaut had been diagnosed with terminal cancer at 23. His family had explored every option, but man, with all his advanced technology, could do nothing for him. At the time of diagnosis, he was given a year. He had turned 24 a mere 2 weeks ago and was beginning to feel the accuracy of that estimation. His whole body had begun to ache. He didn't have to feel the pain, of course. Medicine had come a long way in relieving discomfort without side effects. Until dosing up for this trip, however, Dane had chosen to feel his mortality, knowing the pain would help him gauge his condition. He didn't want to drop dead before making the only choice left to him. Finally, he could take it no more. He had always longed to see the galaxy, and a new service had become available for those on their deathbeds called a Milky Way burial. Shedding tears with his friends and family, he had exercised his free will one last time. And now he was here, at the beautiful end of a beautiful life. Perhaps this would not be his last trip through the cosmos. Could this infinite space be a foretaste of eternity? Did it exist for him to explore to his heart's content in the next life? Mercury was gone, and he felt the temperature fluctuating again. He knew that the coffin would only be able to keep it in check for so long. As the sun grew ever closer, it became brighter and brighter. The coffin began to tint, revealing its spherical form in an attempt to comfort him for as long as it could. Dane had never been more afraid in his life, and yet, oddly enough, he felt a deep peace. Was that possible? He didn't mind the light anymore, despite the fact that its intensity might leave him blind at any moment. It might have been the darkness of space that magnified the beauty of the planets, but Dane liked the prospect of never experiencing it again. He began to sweat profusely, and if he could have felt pain, he would have noticed his skin beginning to blister. It occurred to him that he was staring at the source of life for the entire galaxy, the heart of the Milky Way. What better place to be at this moment? He was reminded of the force inside himself that gave him life. His new heart was a seed, waiting to sprout. His entire life, with all its ups and downs, all its faith and doubt, and all its significance, had led up to this moment. He was both honored and humbled by how beautiful it was. As the coffin increased its speed towards the ball of fire, Dane knew he was seconds away from being as close to the sun as his humanity could sustain. Drawing one last breath, he closed his eyes, but he no longer saw darkness. I hope you liked Empyrean. If you want to dive deeper, check out the song I wrote with the same name. You can get it for free at www.soundcloud.com/theuniversaldonor.